Aisha stood at the entrance of the Axton Enterprises headquarters with her heart thudding so loudly she was certain the security guards could hear it, her breath shallow and uneven as she forced herself to take one hesitant step after another into the marble lobby that gleamed so brightly it reflected her trembling silhouette back at her, each reflection an unspoken reminder of just how out of place she felt in this world of polished shoes, tailored suits, and people who walked with the certainty of those who had never tasted the kind of fear that kept her awake night after night. She clutched her fraying brown handbag to her side as if it were a lifeline, the strap patched and repatched over the years, the stitches done by her own shaking hands after long nights when she couldn't afford even basic repairs, and as she approached the front desk with her breath trapped in her throat, she tried desperately to smooth the wrinkles in her borrowed navy kurta, hoping the receptionist wouldn't notice that the hem had been mended unevenly or that her shoes had long lost their shine, but it didn't matter because the receptionist barely looked up, her manicured nails tapping against the tablet as she said in a clipped, unimpressed tone, "Top floor, executive level, he's waiting," and the way she emphasized he made Aisha's stomach curl because everyone knew who he was. Zion Axton, the elusive single dad CEO with a reputation for brilliance, cold discipline, and standards so high they made even seasoned executives shiver, a man whispered about in the hallways as though he were a myth rather than a person, the architect of a billion-dollar empire and the reason so many employees here worked like they had everything to prove, but none of that mattered to Aisha because all she cared about was that she needed this job. Not for pride, not for ambition, but for survival, because her rent was overdue, because her landlord had shown up that morning with a final warning, because her daughter Mina's school fees were weeks late and the principal's voice had begun to grow colder each time they spoke, because last night little Mina had asked, "Mama, why are you sad?" With those big, innocent eyes that squeezed Aisha's heart until the guilt felt unbearable, and because, worst of all, Aisha had caught herself crying quietly in the bathroom, her hand pressed against her mouth so she wouldn't wake her daughter, sobbing over the terrifying thought that she was failing at everything. Failing as a mother, failing as a provider, failing as a woman who once dared to dream of a stable, peaceful life. The elevator doors slid open and she stepped inside, feeling the air tighten around her as the numbers climbed slowly, 5, 12, 22, 31. Each ding pulling her deeper into the kind of fear that came not from meeting a powerful man, but from the possibility of losing the last chance she had to keep her life from collapsing entirely. Because she had already lost 2 jobs this year, both due to things that weren't even her fault, one because the company downsized and cut the junior staff first, and the second because she had no childcare on a week when Mina had gotten sick and her employer refused to let her take time off, and now here she was wearing the weight of all those failures on her shoulders as though they were stitched permanently to her clothes. The elevator stopped at the 50th floor with a soft chime and the doors opened to a hall so silent and pristine she felt as though she had stepped into a museum rather than an office, the walls adorned with abstract art pieces she couldn't begin to interpret, the floor a seamless stretch of dark wood that swallowed the sound of her hesitant footsteps, and as she moved forward, she passed employees who all looked effortlessly elegant in a way that seemed almost cruel to someone like her. Someone who had spent the morning praying her only pair of presentable sandals wouldn't break on the way here. Finally the receptionist at the executive level, a tall woman with sharp eyeliner and even sharper judgment in her gaze, led her down a long corridor with frosted glass doors on either side and paused at the last door, her expression cool and mildly amused, like she already predicted this timid woman would last only a day under the CEO's gaze. "He doesn't like waiting," the receptionist said curtly before pushing the door open without knocking, and Aisha's breath hitched as she stepped into the room that felt far too big, far too beautiful, far too intimidating for her to belong in, her eyes scanning the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city, the massive oak desk, the minimalist decor, and then, finally, landing on him, the man she had both feared and needed to meet. Zion Axton, standing near the windows with the sunlight turning the edges of his broad shoulders into a halo of sharp gold, his posture rigid yet graceful, his sleeves rolled to his elbows revealing forearms that spoke of a man who didn't spend all his time behind a desk, his expression unreadable as he studied the skyline with the quiet focus of someone who carried more burdens than he ever admitted. When he turned, Aisha felt something strange in her chest. Not attraction, not fear, but a kind of recognition, as if she were looking at someone who, beneath all the control and composure, also understood what it meant to push through life while holding pieces of yourself together. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching into something heavy, something that magnified every insecurity spiraling inside her, making her hyper-aware of the trembling in her hands, the faint scuff marks on her shoes, the fact that she could not afford to fail here because she had nothing left to fall back on. And she lowered her eyes instinctively, hoping he wouldn't see how terrified she was. But Zion wasn't looking at her clothes or her bag or any of the things she feared he would judge. He was looking at her, at the exhaustion etched into her posture, the humility in her bowed head, the anxiety clinging to her like a second skin, and something flickered across his face, something soft, fleeting, almost hidden beneath the layers of the CEO he had taught himself to be. And before she could gather enough courage to speak, he broke the silence, not with harshness or authority or the formality she expected, but with a simple, gentle observation. "You look like you rushed to get here," he said, and Aisha felt heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassment crawling through her chest as she stammered, I did, sir, I'm sorry, I thought I'd be late," even though she didn't owe him an apology for trying her best, for sprinting from the bus stop, for arriving breathless because she had to drop Mina at a neighbor's house at the last minute. Zion nodded slightly, a gesture so calm it almost unsettled her. "You're not late," he said, and though his voice was controlled, there was a softness beneath it she hadn't anticipated, a softness that made the walls she carried inside herself tremble, and she stepped forward, handing him the folder of documents she had triple-checked the night before, her fingers shaking as she extended it, praying he wouldn't notice how the edges of the folder were worn from years of reuse. But of course he did notice, not because he cared about the folder, but because he noticed everything, and as he took the file from her hands, he didn't look down at it immediately. Instead, he studied her face, his brow furrowing as though he were reading something between the lines of her expression, as though her exhaustion was a language he understood but hadn't heard in a long time. And Aisha felt exposed, vulnerable, like he could see every failure she had spent years trying to hide. And she wished she could disappear, wished she could shrink herself into someone more polished, more confident, more worthy of standing in front of a man like him. He finally opened the file, flipping through the pages slowly, not in judgment but in thought, and the silence stretched so thin that Aisha thought she might faint from the weight of it, from the way her anxiety clawed at her throat until she whispered, I know my resume isn't perfect, sir, but I promise I work very hard," her voice cracking despite her best effort to sound composed. But Zion closed the folder gently, almost deliberately, as if telling her the resume wasn't what mattered right now, and he stepped a little closer, not enough to intimidate her, but enough that she could see the faint shadows under his eyes, the subtle weariness of a man who spent nights awake, not because of business, but because of responsibilities he never shared with anyone. And then he said something she did not expect at all. "Miss Aisha, I didn't call you up because of your resume," he said quietly, and her heart sank because she thought this meant rejection, thought he was about to tell her she wasn't qualified, thought he had only brought her here to dismiss her politely. But before panic could swallow her whole, he continued, "I asked you to come up because I wanted to see something for myself," and she blinked in confusion, her breath catching as he regarded her with an intensity that made her feel as though he were peeling back every layer of her facade. Then, after a long pause that stole the air from her lungs, he spoke again, his voice lower this time, almost gentle, almost human in a way that startled her. "I want to ask you something," he said, and the seriousness in his tone made her straighten instinctively, her pulse racing as if bracing for judgment. But instead of asking about her experience, her skills, her background, or even her reasons for seeking the job, he asked her a question that pierced straight through her armor, a question so unexpected, so intimate, so deeply perceptive that it knocked the breath out of her. "Who are you carrying all this weight for?" And just like that, something inside Aisha cracked. So subtly, so quietly she almost didn't notice it, but the question struck a part of her she had buried beneath survival and fear, and her lips parted but no words came out because no employer had ever asked her something like that, no stranger had ever seen her burdened so clearly, and the tears she had been holding back for days stung the corners of her eyes with such urgency she had to blink rapidly to keep them from spilling. But it was too late because he had already seen them, the way her chest tightened, the way she pressed her trembling fingers into the fabric of her kurta as though trying to hold herself together. She swallowed hard, forcing air into her lungs, her voice barely a whisper as she answered, "My daughter," and the moment she said it, the truth of it shook her. Everything she did, every humiliation she endured, every fear she swallowed, every long night she spent worrying, every burden she carried was for Mina, her bright, innocent little girl who deserved a life far better than this, a life Aisha never stopped fighting to provide. Zion's expression softened, something flickering in his dark eyes, a moment of recognition so raw it startled her, as though he too knew what it meant to carry the weight of a child on his shoulders, and before she could lower her gaze again, he said quietly, "Good," and she froze, her breath catching in confusion, and he added, "Because people who carry responsibility for someone else, they are the ones who don't break easily," and his words felt like a hand reaching into the storm inside her, steadying something she didn't realize was trembling so violently. Then he gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Sit, Aisha," he said, not as a command, not as an order, but as an invitation, a reassurance, and she obeyed numbly, lowering herself into the chair as though stepping into a different world, one where someone finally saw her not as a failure, not as a burden, not as a woman who couldn't keep her life together, but as someone trying her hardest with everything she had. And as Zion took his seat across from her, their eyes met just briefly, long enough for her to understand one thing. This meeting, this question, this moment was about to change everything.